And part of what I think is so interesting about your work is you literally named the blog Rogue Health and Fitness, right? You're going rogue from kind of the standard ideas around what to eat, how to exercise, and things like that. And so I thought maybe what we could do is let's start on the diet side, right? Most people are taught kind of a low fat, high carb type diet, and they basically eat what they consider to be that food pyramid. You obviously have a different view of the world. So maybe kind of talk about the work you've done and why you've arrived at something that's different or kind of rogue to those traditional recommendations.
Okay, great. So I think that a lot of the way people eat and how they're recommended to eat and so on, it flows from one single idea, and that idea is a wrong idea, and it's basically the idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. This goes back to the 40s and 50s, and the nutritionist Ansel Keys and the cholesterol idea and so on, and they hit on the idea that saturated fat was killing people. It was a huge problem at the time. Heart disease, it's still a big problem, but it hits mostly much older people now. At the time, they were looking at a lot of middle-aged men dropping dead of heart attacks and so on. So they hit on this idea, and in retrospect, looking at what we know now in the research, it seems wholly mistaken. Nevertheless, by the late 1970s, the US government had latched onto it and put out official dietary recommendations that we should avoid eating a lot of saturated fat, that we should eat a lot of whole grains, that fruits and vegetables were uniquely healthy, and so on and so forth. And that is the basis for how most people are eating now. Let me back up a little. As far as the saturated fat goes, there have been several meta-analyses, which are basically reviews of studies done in the last decade that have shown that intake of dietary saturated fat is not related to coronary heart disease. I come from a perspective of thinking, why does the Western world, the modern Western world, suffer from these diseases like heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's, diabetes, and so on, and why have these all increased in recent years, and why do some other societies not have them, essentially? For example, there's an island in the South Pacific, the Catawbans, the island of Catawba, where these people live, and they have no chronic disease whatsoever, as far as they've found. People have gone there and investigated them, and that despite the fact that 75% of the men smoke cigarettes. I'm not saying that cigarettes are benign by any means, but I'm just saying, I'm pointing out this fact. Why do these people have seemingly no chronic disease? If you go back in time, why did these, even in the Western world, why were these diseases so scarce, and why are they common now? Well, my main conclusion is that chronic diseases are, as someone has said, they might be better termed the diseases of processed food. So in the late 19th century, there were technologies developed, for example, that were able to make white flour. There was little to no white flour before that, but then they, with the Industrial Revolution and these gigantic milling machines, they were able to make white flour, and everybody started using it. Sugar has been around a little bit longer, but it became a lot cheaper. And so as it became cheaper and cheaper, people started using more of it. A couple hundred years ago in the US, per capita consumption was like 5 pounds a year or something like that, whereas it's, in the range of 150 pounds now. And then one other invention that happened in the late 19th century was they figured out how to extract oils from seeds. This started out actually as a way to try to make cotton seeds, which were a waste product, profitable, to get something out of them, and they did. And ultimately, they made Crisco. The CO on that last part of Crisco stands for cottonseed oil. And they applied this to a number, of different oils. So now, for example, soybean oil is the most common oil, and corn oil, canola oil, et cetera, all these oils. So you put those all together, and you've got modern food. And you put them together in a certain way, in certain combinations, and you've got modern ultra-processed food that people eat huge amounts of. So in the United States, approximately 60% of calories in the average diet comes from these ultra-processed foods. So that's a huge amount. So these are what I'm talking about specifically are the kind of foods that come in boxes and bags that are brightly labeled, have brand names, that are found in the middle aisles of the supermarket. And that's what most people eat. So that is what has caused our modern epidemic of chronic disease, in my estimation. Now, we've had even, a lot of this goes back to the invention of agriculture, right? So before agriculture, everyone was a hunter-gatherer. Everyone ate meat, and whatever wild vegetation they could gather. And as far as we know, they suffered from none of these chronic diseases that we have now. Then when agriculture was invented, people started eating lots of grains, and they started suffering from a lot of chronic diseases. For example, a really good example of this is that before agriculture, the average man was something like 5'9" tall. After agriculture, they were 5'3". And there was all kinds of, with the same, proportionate decrease in women. And they found in skeletal remains that have been studied and so on, chronic diseases, osteoarthritis, so on and so forth. Infectious diseases also became very prominent. At any rate, we lived like that for a long time. In recent years, say the 19th century, people started getting much taller again due to better nutrition. But then we took a second hit. We took this industrial food hit that I was just talking about, starting around 1900, say. Heart disease started rising as an epidemic, basically. In 1900, there was essentially zero heart disease. Famous cardiologist Paul Dudley White, who was the most famous cardiologist at mid-century, said that when he was training in the early years of the century, nobody ever talked about coronary artery disease because nobody had it. No, they didn't know it existed. And then people started having heart attacks and so on, till by the mid 20th century, you had huge numbers of heart attacks and so on, heart disease epidemic. So then, fast forward to a couple of decades ago, and then we had these dietary guidelines after they decided that saturated fat was bad. And then the obesity epidemic started going right about that time. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. There are other factors, I believe, but the fact that people were told to eat less meat and animal products and to eat more carbohydrates. I believe very much contributed to it. So there we are. There's the food element, and that is my explanation of why this has happened.